All right, it's a little past 11. I think it's a good time to start. Well, morning everyone. My name is Rahul Ravindran, Chief Technology Officer of Global Infonet and VTSP with Microsoft, just one of the many acronyms from Microsoft for Virtual Technology Solutions Professional. It's just a specialized skill for Azure, SharePoint, and custom software development. But today we're going to talk about Azure Platform as a Service offerings. It is one or more of our series on the cloud on your terms. If you have not caught up on our past sessions, we should have them up on our YouTube or globalinfonet.com website. But let's get started. No obligatory who are we slide. We are Global Infonet, a custom software and Azure and SharePoint services offering company located in Jacksonville, Florida. We've been in business for about 15 years. Rated highly by a customer satisfaction agency and as well as named as one of the fastest growing companies in Northeast Florida. To learn more about us, feel free to visit our website, global-infonet.com, and you should have a link towards the end of the presentation. Today we're going to talk about Azure in general. We'll start out with an Azure overview, and I'll also log into the latest Azure tenants so you can kind of get a chance to see how the tenant could look like, and also how you could potentially get started with your own Azure instance. We'll also take a step back and talk about some of the interesting transitions in the industry, try and help build an understanding of the value of the cloud and how it can potentially benefit your business. As we go along here, feel free to ask questions along the way using the chat window in the bottom right-hand corner of your GoToMeeting slide box. If you have any trouble hearing me or with the presentation in general, feel free to raise a hand using the little hand icon on the GoToMeeting window towards the middle of the tool. If you've got questions, we'll attempt to answer it on the fly. But if your question is slightly off topic, we'll try and address them towards the end. All right, let's get started. I want to start with the three important aspects of the cloud, right? I mean, when we start talking about the cloud, the three benefits that stand out is speed, scale, and economics. And economics gets most attention from most people. Speed in terms of how can I use the cloud to deploy and develop applications faster. Scalability in terms of how can we develop applications or deploy infrastructure worry-free in knowing that it can scale with the growth of your business. Economics allowing you to track your spending down to hourly and even minutely for some services, and also knowing that you don't have to invest in traditional infrastructure at the start of your application development, and the ability to grow as you grow with your business without an upfront major hardware or infrastructure investment. This economic used to be pretty simple about 10 years ago. We're living in changing times. Cloud used to be an interesting concept in about 2005, but now has grown into a little bit more of an interesting overview where it provides an opportunity to augment your business in interesting ways. If you look at the past, traditionally we're used to our three-tier application development model with a presentation, a business logic, and our choices came down to picking out the right relational database for your business. And from the database side, an enterprise organization would invest in a master data platform. We'll build some transactional data models on top of it, and for reporting and integration purposes, you typically invest in a data warehouse and surface our overall warehouse in the form of data marts to link with other applications. This model has stood up with the test of time for about 20-30 years now, but we're living in interesting times where this decisions is not quite that simple. We now have to choose from more than just relational databases with the inception of NoSQL databases, just software as a service models that allows you to integrate with existing data models. Our business logic is no longer tied to one monolithic application block. We now have the liberty of choosing between one or more services and integrating within more than one presentation layer, right? We're no longer living in an encapsulated world of either a desktop application or web application. We now have to think mobile, think web apps, think custom solutions that can span a tablet to a mobile device and to more than one type of presentation media. This kind of shift is making us take advantage of more than just one platform offering, right? If you look at the world today, it's vastly more complex. We have thousands of tools and technologies to choose from, and provisioning each one of these tools takes specialized skill set in some cases. Attaching and layering these tools to fit your business is ever present more challenging. Just the art of picking up a database solution in itself provides enough of a challenge to warrant looking into platform offerings that's not the norm. The biggest shift that I want to highlight here is the gradual shift from infrastructure to a more application-focused architecture concepts. Some of the questions today are why aren't we investing in apps that looks like it's surpassing the pace of our investment in traditional infrastructure, right? How can we invest in enterprise applications that can scale very quickly without upfront infrastructure investment? What is the benefit of using application as a service model or a software as a service model versus our traditional monolithic layer? When we shift our thinking into application specific versus infrastructure specific, it leads us to implement interesting architectures that are very different from our traditional three-tier models. In a traditional data center, we think about our applications and our database models in a very siloed capacity. We've got very tight coupling between one or more relational databases and the services on top of it. When we think about a cloud infrastructure, things start to break apart a bit. You may have heard of the concept of microservices and loosely coupled applications. This is a shift that started about 3-4 years ago. We think of not just one database. We try and segregate our database based on their use case. So you may have a traditional SQL database. You may have a NoSQL solution to store more non-relational type of data. We are looking at more than one kind of tool to slice that data and surface it in a reporting fashion. And these concepts naturally pay way to thinking outside of just a database block and a web server block. We need to think about caching. We need to think about CDN. We need to think about mobile services. We need to think about how to tie in our application to more than one type of development model as well. And that also directly impacts how we develop applications. Traditionally, we are used to our development set of servers that could be in its own little VLAN, and we have a staging, QA, UAT environment, and we have a production infrastructure that carries through a systematic deployment process. If we were to spin up infrastructure for each and every one of our applications to support this kind of model, it's to quite a bit of investment that cannot be revoked in an easy manner. When we think about DevOps operations in a cloud infrastructure, it allows us to segment them in a more granular fashion, as well as have security and compliance and process in place to kind of tie them in together. And we'll take a look at what some of these concepts from an Azure standpoint, and many of these concepts can be applied to more than one cloud infrastructure, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about them as well. I'm sure you're all familiar with this slide here. You may have come across a management breakdown kind of slide and the differences between infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service. But I wanted to revisit this with a focus on applications versus just infrastructure. So we're all familiar with our traditional on-premises model of, well, hosting everything on-premise. In an infrastructure as a service model, which a lot of organizations have already invested in, we at least have a virtualization platform where we can easily spin up virtual machines that can adapt to changing business needs. Platform as a service is a relatively new concept, although we've been familiar with a software as a service model such as Office 365 or SharePoint Online, CRM Online, and we're used to that kind of a platform where we can sufficiently use a software without worrying about the hosting side of it or management side of it. But platform as a service is a little bit more interesting. It kind of sits in between the infrastructure and with giving you a little bit more control, but not taking away all of the control as it would be from a software as a service standpoint. So what if we could live in a world where we don't have to worry about, well, we are already not worrying about our virtual machine, but what if we could live in a world where we don't need to worry about even the operating system layer? What if we don't have to worry about our web hosting technology? If we could surpass our thinking beyond, services like IIS, Internet Information Services, or Apache for hosting, if we could think of caching as not managing a bunch of servers and manually managing RAM and other concepts, if we could live in without worrying about SQL Server instances and how to independently scale SQL Server, how to set up DR and set up active-active SQL Server cluster, but just worry about our individual SQL. That's what a platform as a service model gives you. Let your cloud hosting provider take control of your virtual machine layer as well as your operating system and your hosting software on top of it, and you worry about your website, your application, your database, and specific things that you code and develop and deploy. And that's the interesting focus of Azure. And when we think about cloud hosting service providers such as Amazon Web Services or a numerous number of public hosting providers, there is an increasing shift in just focusing on infrastructure as a service offering. Azure is one of the most unique platforms that allows you to focus on a platform as a service model versus worrying about infrastructure. So we will dissect what it means to your business when we look at our application strictly from a platform as a service standpoint. And like I always say, let's think about apps and services, not servers and not operating systems and not your hosting solution. If you look at a Microsoft Azure Stack from an architecture standpoint, we are already abstracted from our storage, networking, compute, management, security side, and you've got control over your infrastructure as a service in terms of virtual machines and other platforms on top of it, such as even your virtual networking, virtual machines that you can still spin up and operate, and your platform as a service offerings such as Azure Mobile App, Web App, Mobile Services, recently announced SQL Data Warehouse, Azure Mobile Services sits right on top of it. We also have the liberty of managing these services using a newly launched Azure Resource Manager. Well, it's been around for a couple of years, but it allows you to manage your services in a little bit more granular capacity. On top of that, we've got DevOps tools such as PowerShell and APIs to dynamically manage your infrastructure without going through the portal or clicking through the GUI. But we also have the portal as well, which is also being revamped, which I will demonstrate in a little bit. And on top of all that, we've got multiple baseline operating system images to choose from, primarily being Windows Server and Linux. And you have the liberty to create your own images, host them, and abstract them away just as you would for a traditional hosting solution as well. You may have seen an Azure overview kind of slides where we talk about different types of services, but I thought this is a little bit more interesting when we segregate infrastructure services versus platform services, and you can see that not a whole lot of change in terms of Azure infrastructure service offerings in the last several years. I mean, Azure has always supported virtual machines and blob storage, virtual network, and VPN gateway. Some of the newer offerings are the newly launched Azure Files, You now have the ability to have Express Route, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. You've got Traffic Manager and an Application Gateway, which are some of the new infrastructure service offerings, but by and large, they tend to achieve the same purpose and hasn't changed in recent past. But when we shift our thinking to the Azure Platform Services, quite a bit has changed in this space. In fact, every week we're used to seeing yet another Azure Platform as a service being launched, and more services are moving away from preview offerings to general availability. So now is a good time to take a step back and look at all of the Azure Platform Service offerings and try and figure out how it can fit to your business. So for instance, the most common Azure Platform Service offerings are Azure Web Apps and Azure SQL databases, which allows you to develop web applications without worrying about IaaS or hosting server level details and just worrying about your application. SQL Server databases allow you to host a single SQL Server database without worrying about SQL Server. And as far as SQL Server 2016, Azure SQL Database and SQL Server 2016 are in feature parity, which means 99.9% of all services all features that's offered by a traditional SQL Server database, if you were hosted in an on-premise capacity, is now supported on Azure SQL Database. The big announcements for SQL Server 2016 and Azure SQL Database were in terms of geospatial schema offerings and things of that nature are now all supported in Azure SQL Database. This allows you to, in most circumstances, to literally take a backup of your on-premise SQL database and deploy it directly to Azure SQL Database. You have a couple of options in terms of how you can host it, but for the most part, you can host it in a traditional capacity that you're used to, except that you're abstracted from the SQL Server instance. A newly launched service still in preview is a SQL Data Warehouse. That used to be one of the big omissions from Azure SQL offering, which was not having a solid data warehousing model. So SQL Server Analytics Services and data warehouses and cubes and multidimensional models were not present in Azure, but that's quickly changing with the launch of SQL Data Warehouse. And with that, most of your hosting models on SQL Server on-premise is now taken care of. On the website and the front-end side of the story, Azure has always had a good hosting mechanism for Azure Web Applications, and an Azure Web Application supports pretty much IaaS, not just for ASP.NET. If you have invested in non-Microsoft solutions such as PHP, Node.js applications, all of which are natively supported, with the emphasis being native, it's not an afterthought. If you've got a PHP service, it will work directly in Web App, and as well as Java, Node.js, and other services. From a compute integration standpoint, just last year we've got Azure Remote App, which allows you to rethink VDI infrastructure. So if you've got investments in VMware instances where if you use Citrix or VMware for VDI infrastructure, Azure now provides a hosted solution for Remote App. It also supports most of the features that you're used to from a traditional Azure Remote Desktop model, and in fact has all of the RDP capabilities that you may be used to from a traditional Azure Remote Desktop infrastructure standpoint. So quite a bit of interesting things going on. If you're into application development, Visual Studio Online now supports all of the features of TFS on-premise, with the exception of TFS team portals. So if you're looking at if you're already invested in TFS or Team Foundation Server for your source control storage needs, we now have a software as a service model in terms of Visual Studio that allows you to take advantage of source control in the cloud, as well as support of TFS traditional protocols and Git, and on top of that have the ability to manage your project using traditional project management features that you might be used to seeing in Project Server and other PM tools, which is now, at least a subset of that is now available in Visual Studio. This is good news because as you can see, Visual Studio Online is giving you more capabilities at a lower cost than hosting your TFS instance locally. From a security side of the story, Azure's always supported Azure Active Directory, but we now have Premium Active Directory, which allows you to take control of more security features, as well as set up custom sign-in pages and set up multi-factor authentication, all of which are interesting capabilities that's a little bit harder if you have identity providers strictly on-premise. What we'll do right now is take a lap around these services on the Azure website, and as well as take a peek at the Azure portal, which should provide some interesting insight into how to launch services, how to manage applications directly from a portal standpoint. So I'm going to switch gears here real quick and just log into the Azure website. So I figured we'll start from the public-facing website, which, unlike most Microsoft solutions, the Azure website actually gives you quite a bit of information versus being tiered into like a TechNet or MSDN article. So let's take a peek at some of the product offerings. So we talked about compute, virtual machines, then cloud services, and remote app. There's a couple more options out there, such as Service Fabric, which allows you to build distributed applications, Azure Container Service, which is beyond the scope of our discussion, and cloud services, which we will talk about in a little bit in our presentation. Web and mobile is what gets most interest from customers, which has been rebranded as App Service. Traditionally, this used to be known as Azure Websites, which is now rebranded as an App Service, and the App Service has been segmented into 4 compartments. Web apps, which is your traditional website. Mobile apps allow you to host mobile-specific services, and also mobile APIs and specific integration gateways. So if you've got Android apps or iPhone apps or even Windows mobile apps, you can host a backend for these services using Azure mobile apps. So one of the questions that I get is, well, why would I use a mobile app gateway versus just using a traditional web app? And most of this comes down to just management, ease of deployment, and also the ability to gain analytical information. So if you're on a mobile platform, chances are you want to take advantage of interesting metrics like how many deployments have I had, what are some of the services that customers are using in my mobile application. And the mobile apps platform allows you to gain interesting insight into some of these some of the features that used by customers within their mobile device. Logic Apps is an interesting new addition. It's been around for about a year. So think of traditional Windows services and backend service models, which can be now automated using Logic Apps. It's not a literal one-to-one transition. It's not purely with the intent of hosting backend services. Logic Apps allows you to set up interesting integrations utilizing easy-to-use GUI as well as PowerShell and custom tools. This might be worth expanding on a little bit. So you can log into the mobile apps, Logic App page here and look at, watch the first video over here, which shows you how you can segment your application in terms of microservices and connect them and have a background service that can do traditional long-term processing and things of that nature. So this might be worthwhile to check out. And API apps are just that, the ability to host web services in the cloud. API management allows you to manage more than one API and also give you analytic information. Notification hubs we will talk about in a little bit. Mobile engagement is some of the features we talked about in mobile apps apply to here. Azure Functions are new. Azure Functions allow you to build out PowerShell scripted quick automation features that can span beyond Logic Apps, and this is a new service offering intended to go live end of this year. From a data storage standpoint, we already talked about SQL databases. DocumentDB is Azure's answer to NoSQL databases in the cloud. So if you're familiar with MongoDB or other types of NoSQL solutions, consider looking at DocumentDB, which gives you a NoSQL solution with minimal deployment or configuration in the cloud, with enough control in terms of partitioning, sharding, and that kind of thing for performance reasons. Redis Cache is a replacement for what you could think of as traditional Azure App Fabric caching. Redis used to be an independent tool owned by an independent company. Since Microsoft acquired them, you now have access to lightweight, super fast caching in the cloud. Storage and a couple of other services are beyond the scope of our discussion, but SQL Data Warehouse is something that's a new service and something you can take a look at directly when it launches. We're going to skip over some of these items. You can see there's quite a bit of things going on here that you may take advantage of, and switch our conversation to the Azure Dashboard. So I've logged into an Azure Dashboard, and for those who may have played around with Azure in the past, you may be used to the traditional portal experience, which has now been changed to this new experience that allows you to maintain a dashboard that can quickly showcase interesting metrics of your most critical applications, as well as give you the ability to quickly launch new services and new applications directly from within the portal. So let's take a peek at some of our app services that we've got hosting in this demo instance. So you can see here I've got a couple of applications being hosted, and as I expand on an individual application, it gives you information as far as information in terms of some monitoring capabilities, as well as some deployment information. So you can access a traditional Azure web application using FTP or using web deploy and directly deploy on here. But more interestingly enough, you've got a plethora of options here on the right that allows you to control and fine-tune your web application. This is true for pretty much any Azure Platform as a Service offering. You have the quick, easy snapshot of essential information, some monitoring information, and the ability to fine-tune your Platform as a Service model hosted in Azure with more granular information. I also wanted to quickly showcase some of the options available within Azure. So you can see these are all the Azure Platform as a Service and Infrastructure as a Service options available. But if none of these options fit your need, you can always look at the Azure Store, which gives you pre-built images and other offerings from third-party solution providers that might be a better fit versus the out-of-the-box offerings from Azure. And we'll take a look at the Azure Marketplace and the Azure Store towards the end of our presentation. So let's switch gears back into our deck. Hopefully that was insightful in terms of how we can log in to the Azure portal. And before I move away from this page, I also want to give you a little bit of information on how you can get started. So if you do not have an Azure instance today, there's a couple of ways you can get started. The easiest would be to go back to the Azure website, hit free account, sign up with a mobile device and a credit card, and you will have access to a subscription worth about $200. And within the context of the $200, you can use that to launch any Azure service, play around with it, and once you've hit your credit ceiling there, you can switch to a pay-as-you-go model. If you're a Microsoft shop and if you've got an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, chances are, which most customers are surprised with, is that you already have an Azure subscription or credits available as part of your enterprise agreement. If you're a Microsoft shop and you have not invested in an enterprise agreement, but if you're looking at the lowest and the painless option to get on Azure, consider investing in a server and cloud enrollment, which gives you ability to get a quick subscription using a purchase order in increments of $1,200. That's $100 per month, and you can start as low as $1,200 and go as high as you like, and that gives you a subscription that you can then segment into multiple use cases and distribute it among your organization to different users. Quick information here, the subscriptions that you see on my screen here can be dissected into multiple subscriptions, and if you have a server and cloud agreement or an enterprise agreement, you can create multiple subscriptions and assign it to different DevOps team within your organization to deploy and play around with Azure services quickly. So quite a different ways to get started with Azure. And if you have any questions on onboarding and initial integration, there are plenty of service providers, much like us, who can assist you with that. Our most common conversation is, well, if I spin up an Azure cloud, how can I connect my on-premise infrastructure to the cloud, which gets into the model of a hybrid cloud, which is again beyond the scope of our discussion. But in a quick nutshell, you have the ability to use Azure networking using VPN gateway to connect your on-premise data center to Azure. You also have the ability to have a high-speed connection directly to your Azure data center using ExpressRoute, both of which are excellent options to connect your on-premise data center and your existing information with the cloud, which allows Azure to essentially act as an extension of your existing data center. Questions on any of these topics that I just talked about, feel free to type that in the chat, and we'll take it up towards the end. So let's switch back to the deck real quick. So going back to our Azure platform service offerings, you can see that there's a lot going on here, and what you see on the screen is just a subset of the overall Azure offerings, and this is changing every week. What I'd like to do now is dissect some of the most popular Azure platform services and talk about them in a little bit more detail. So the most common Azure platform as a service offering model used by most customers is the Azure Web App. I know the slide says websites, which is being rebranded to Web App. And in a nutshell, what Azure Web App lets you do is deploy ASP.NET, Node.js, PHP, or Java applications directly into a hosting container and deploy using FTP or directly from a source control, or if you've got continuous integration or other deployment tools or configuration managers, use these tools to directly deploy to Azure Web App, and also have the ability to set up a dev, QA, and prod infrastructure directly in the cloud and have a systematic processes to move from one environment to the other. Azure Web Apps can be launched in many different ways. So the most basic option is a free option. A step up from that is a shared instance, and you can also move up to standard and more on from there. So what an instance refers to is a unitized block of compute and memory power for your web application. As you increase your instance sizing, you gain access to more than one hosting container, and Azure allows you to have a load balancer to segregate requests between more than one web app. You also have the ability to have reserved instances, which has been since changed to standard or premium tiers. In a standard or premium tier, you have dedicated compute power, much like having a dedicated server or a VPS server, virtual private servers that you might be used to in a traditional hosting capacity. So regardless of the size of web application, the standard and the premium tiers go up to several tens of gigs of memory, and storage is virtually unlimited in terms of how much storage you can attach to your web application. And you have the ability to spin up literally hundreds of web app instances to quickly and easily horizontally scale your application based on demand. I should also mention that Azure also has automation capabilities to automatically spin up web applications based on load, so you don't have to, this is not a manual step. You can set up Azure to automatically spin up a new web app instance if compute peaks over 80% or if memory threshold increases to over 80 or 90%, and there are different rules you can set up to spin these up automatically. Another popular service is Azure Mobile Services, which allows you to build quick back-end gateways for mobile applications that may be deployed onto Windows phones or iOS or Android devices. Interestingly enough, in the recent past, we're also seeing HTML5 based web applications using PhoneGap or Cordova and many other tools. But what they all have in common is a distinctive need to manage back-end operations such as identity, push notifications, which is always a common use case for a mobile device, background jobs for things like capturing image information, payment processing, that kind of thing, all of which can be neatly housed in one or more Azure mobile services. This allows us to further segment back-end hosting gateways or back-end services for a mobile application into distinctive buckets of different data platforms and identity services, where we're living in a world where a user may prefer to log into a mobile application using a social media tool or using their Microsoft account or Google account, and there are multiple identity providers that can provide this experience, and Azure allows you to segment them neatly in the cloud and giving you multiple options as far as how to let a user authenticate into your application. If none of these use cases fit your model, you also have the ability to write custom scripts in terms of PowerShell or even C# code that allows you to take finer control into custom use cases for your specific application. Notification hubs, which is now a separate service, but in the interest of this demonstration, I'm putting them under mobile services, allows you to manage notifications using a central gateway. Therefore, you could have a single use news item that can be pushed into the hub, which will automatically segment them between an Android app or an iOS app, as well as tablet devices or desktop application. So this allows you to have quick and easy information gateways without tying these code in specific to your application. And the notification hubs are reusable, so you could potentially have more than one notification hubs powering more than one mobile applications or tablet devices. Azure Cloud Services are an interesting mechanism to package distinct services, databases, and applications into one bucket. So if your web application depends on a SQL database or a caching media in Azure, we can neatly tie them up under the context of a cloud service and manage them as a group. What's interesting about this model is that you can create a package that can be then deployed across a dev UAT or prod capacity and not just contain application-specific files, but also contain infrastructure information in terms of how many virtual machines or how many web applications does your cloud service require. All of this infrastructure information can be packaged into your cloud service package and deploy as a single solution. This also allows you to deploy code in a reusable manner very quickly and easily, and also transition between different tiers. You can specify infrastructure information, but you can also let Azure take control of the load balancing portion or the information segmentation portion without having to tie all of this into application code. This allows us to focus on our applications versus infrastructure. So if you look at our application building blocks, and this is just a subset of the overall offerings in Azure, we can at least segment them into different buckets. So you've got our database, we need storage solutions, we have the ability to manage traffic caching and messaging if you've got more than one application block and if you need to rely on service buses or messaging capabilities, you have that as a service as well. Identity providers could be Azure, ADE and ADFS built into Azure or integrate with other identity providers. If your application spans more than one geographic region, you have the ability to take advantage of Azure CDN content delivery network to deploy images, CSS, JavaScript, that kind of thing across multiple geographic blocks, and as well as networking and media services. So SQL database is always a popular option that is pretty much required for any application that you can think of. And just so you know, Azure SQL Database is the only platform as a service model directly from Azure, but offerings such as DB2 and Oracle are available in the form of images that can also be spun up using various parameters that can give you a closed platform as a service model, but still being hosted in virtual machines. And that story might change in the future as well. So SQL database is always an interesting use case. The ability to host your SQL database out without worrying about SQL Server or clustering or high availability backups, DR, is the perfect use case for a public cloud offering such as Azure. Azure SQL Database allows you to host your relational SQL model in the cloud. It's automatically clustered for high availability, but you can also reserve multiple instances in multiple geographic location if you should choose so. And it is a full managed service, so things like backup and restore are for the most part automatic. You have a 99.99% SLA directly out of the box with the ability to move up to higher tiers that can guarantee more. And Azure SQL databases natively support reporting, not to be confused with SQL Server reporting services, which is not available in Azure. Caching is a popular option for web applications that needs a quick and easy solution to store a bunch of information that is unlikely to change over time. If you're used to .NET caching, the Azure caching as a service option is it can be directly used with it. The Azure Cache also supports other legacy third-party caching solutions, but with the advent of Redis Cache, we have even more control over how we can control caching. So I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about distributed caching. In a nutshell, you've got the ability to spin up a caching instance that can be shared with more than one web app or database roles and take advantage of a distributed caching cluster and control them from a central gateway. Service bus is quickly gaining, quickly gaining traction in an increasingly microservice model. So if you're building your application in sets of different blocks in terms of your web application, hosting front end, having more than one backend service blocks, handling different kinds of need, a secure and easy to use messaging option between these tools makes a lot of sense and allows you to craft applications in a loosely coupled fashion. So we are a traditional architecture of having a front-end application strictly tying into a back-end service that then talks to a typical front-end portion as well. So in this instance, we're having a store front-end application that's talking to a shipping service and a service for drivers. The challenge with an application that's tied into or tightly coupled into in itself, if you lose one side of it, you potentially have a better or bad experience across all of your receiving options. In format, we have the ability to store information from a messaging standpoint, or more blocks fail, you still have to connect them to your receiving ends in an easy to use manner. This becomes more prevalent you horizontally scale your application using multiple web apps, allowing all of your web apps to talk to one central queue and let the queue manage how to provision your provision information between the endpoints that is subscribed to. If you think about a traditional, you got your standard application talking to a backend app which uses a service bus or messaging queue, and your front-end application that's hosted in a desktop capacity is simply reading from one or more queues and displaying information in a tiered fashion. We can architect this in several different ways. In an enterprise application, we could have the application using a specific service bus relay segmented behind corporate firewalls and still maintain the ability to have an end-to-end communication channel. Azure Media Services is another popular option, especially if you're in the business of hosting media content, or even have your popular option of just having training or video content on your website and having the ability to have streaming capability based on bandwidth and that kind of thing. But more importantly, it also serves as a platform to have real-time encoding and hosting all built into one platform. So for instance, if you've got a native video feed that you'd like to directly upload to Azure and take advantage of real-time encoding into a web-friendly format and broadcast it to multiple users, the Azure Media Services provide a compelling platform to achieve that, much like using Twitch or YouTube hosting services. This just gives you a different way to do that with more granular control as may be required for your business needs. So we took a quick look around some of the application building blocks of Azure, and I thought we'd spend a little bit of time looking at the Azure Store, which gives you the ability to access third-party tools and other offerings beyond what's available out of the box in the Azure portal. We'll quickly step back to our portal and take a look at some of the capabilities already available. So as I go into the new option here, I have the ability to look at the Marketplace. Within the Marketplace, if you just leave it at everything, you have literally thousands of third-party applications that's hosted. So maybe a good example is right here in the highlight here. If today you use SharePoint on-premise, and if you'd like to use SharePoint in the cloud, typically you would go about this operation by setting up a virtual machine for your web front-end server, a couple more virtual machines to handle search, user profile synchronization, and other components. And you'd also spin up virtual machines for SQL Server databases. What if you could, with using a few clicks, deploy a highly available SharePoint on the cloud infrastructure without going through the manual processes of spinning up virtual machines and configuring them, and let Azure do that job for you automatically? So that's precisely what this particular option lets you do, is allow Azure to automatically spin up virtual machines, configure them, set up the right firewall rules and that kind of thing without you lifting a finger. So you don't have to manually create virtual machines and control them. So this is not quite platform as a service offering, but what it does is automate the infrastructure required to support something like SharePoint, which if you have dealt with SharePoint deployments, it can be very complex, very time-consuming, and if not done right, minor errors can seriously slow down your deployment timings. So that's just a quick example of a platform, an infrastructure automation option available in the Azure Store. As we scroll down here, you can see there are other platform offerings that is outside of Microsoft, even though the SharePoint option was still from Microsoft, not officially listed in the azure.microsoft.com website, but it is a a package created directly by Microsoft. You also have other opportunities from different third-party providers, and they span everything from infrastructure to DevOps automation options, as well as allowing you to host third-party services. So a good example is Ubuntu as a server. Even though we've got images for things such as Red Hat Linux image and that kind of thing, if you really wanted to host Ubuntu as a service configured for the cloud, you have the ability to do that. Dynamics AX and other Microsoft Dynamics product are an interesting offering. So if you've got Microsoft Dynamics GP, NAV, AX, or CRM, you're typically trying to decide between two options: hosting your Dynamics offering on-premise, or using Dynamics CRM Online or SharePoint Online, which is two polar opposites in terms of your deployment option. But what if you wanted to host it in the cloud but not give up control over the infrastructure side? Then you could potentially use a pre-made image that would automatically launch databases and servers pre-configured and wired for networking. So by quickly just searching and typing in, chances are if you're attempting to deploy a third-party solution, you have the option of potentially finding that as a ready-made image. And I encourage you to look at the Azure Store and discover more options and figure out if they might be a good fit for your business. So I figure that's a very good thing to, a very good tool to be aware of. Another tool that's highly useful as you think about Azure is the official Azure pricing calculator, which has been considerably revamped mid of last year and now gives a more granular approach of configuring your services. So if you're quickly trying to determine how much would it cost for me to move a single application to the cloud, you can begin by doing that by selecting your app service, selecting a SQL database, and then going down here and choosing the data center. So if you're going to host an application that will be consumed US-wide, chances are you might want to pick Central US and choose the right tier, and you can gain more information about tiers in a quick snapshot here, as well as gain more information directly in the primary page of the tool. And let's consider assuming a web app tool that might run in a 2-instance capacity throughout the month, and you can also change instance sizing and gain a glimpse of some of the options here. And every web app more than likely would need a backend database service. So let's also put this in North Central US, choose a single database option, choose a standard tier, and play around here. What this gives you ultimately is a snapshot of what the cost would look like at the end, which gives you a very realistic pricing before you even begin your Azure journey, by just coming into the pricing portal and getting to know your return on investment up front, which is wildly different from other kind of hosting solutions where it's very difficult to calculate an ROI purely by segmenting it and trying to figure out. You need to think in terms of servers, which is difficult because servers are limited in its capacity to truly showcase the dedicated compute and memory options they provide for you. So another tool that's nice and handy to have in your wheelhouse, and it covers pretty much all Azure services. So very quickly you can build a comprehensive services topology here that can closely align to your on-premises infrastructure and gain some glimpse of that as well. You can also export this estimate, which is a useful way to dissect it, especially if you want to fine-tune and refine it and pass it around to management and other decision makers. And you can quickly change some things here as well and gain a quick snapshot. Another tool that I'm just going to mention but not going to go into too much depth is the Azure or Cloud Readiness Assessment tool, which is now available as part of Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, which can scan your entire infrastructure and give you a quick snapshot, as well as give you a report of services that may not be compatible with Azure, so you can plan for potential migration issues up front. So hopefully this is useful information in terms of some of the tools that's available to support your Azure implementation journey. And let's quickly switch back to the deck here. So the Azure Store is, well, really the last tool that I want to show you. And from a platform as a service side, now that's it for this particular demo. We'll just take a quick overview. We looked at Azure as a whole. We looked at some of the Azure hosting opportunity differences between infrastructure as a service, Azure offerings, as well as platform as a service offerings. Took a quick peek on the Azure portal where you can quickly launch applications and databases very easily just using a GUI, as well as look at launch application services from the Azure Store, which allows you to quickly deploy applications that's outside of the scope of out-of-the-box Azure applications and services, and as well as take a slightly deeper dive into specific platform as a service offerings from Azure and how that might be beneficial. Obviously, I didn't cover all platform options. There are very interesting and niche use cases such as machine learning and data warehousing that might greatly benefit if you're in the need for such a tool with the infrastructure being abstracted from it. But hopefully that gives you a quick overview of some of the platform as a service offerings from Azure. So I'm giving about 5 minutes toward the end to address any questions if you've got any. Feel free to type that, or if you'd like to speak, raise your hand and we can unmute your audio feed. All right, no questions. We will give you a copy of this deck in the next couple of days or so. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reply on that email, and we can have a conversation outside of this webinar. Thank you again for joining us this morning. Hope you have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you in the next webinar.